The amber sunset bled across the Montana sky as Sarah Blackwood sat alone on the weathered bench outside the Last Chance Saloon, her delicate fingers clutching a worn leather-bound journal. It was 1876, and the small mining town of Redemption Creek had seen better days, much like Sarah herself. Her dark chestnut hair cascaded down her back, partially hidden beneath a modest bonnet that had traveled with her all the way from Boston, waiting for someone or leaving one. A deep voice rumbled beside her. Sarah's gaze lifted slowly to meet piercing blue eyes beneath the brim of a dusty Stetson. The tall cowboy stood with one boot propped on the step, his weathered face telling stories his lips hadn't shared. His question hung in the air between them like gun smoke after a duel. "Neither," she replied, her voice stronger than she expected. "Or perhaps both, does it matter?" A half smile crossed his sun-leathered face. "Name's Yates Morgan." He tipped his hat slightly. "And in my experience, madam, it always matters." Sarah closed her journal with deliberate care. 3 weeks in this frontier town had taught her to be cautious around strangers, especially men who asked questions. Still, there was something in his eyes, not the usual hunger she'd grown accustomed to seeing, but something quieter, almost kind. "Sarah Blackwood," she offered, though not inviting further conversation. Yates nodded, studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You don't belong here," he stated simply. "And where exactly do I belong, Mr. Morgan?" she challenged, raising her chin slightly. He chuckled, a warm sound that seemed to soften the harsh lines of his face. "I reckon that's what you're trying to figure out." He gestured to the empty space beside her. "Mind if I sit? Been riding since dawn." After a moment's hesitation, Sarah shifted slightly, making room on the bench. The saloon behind them was beginning to fill, piano music and boisterous laughter spilling out into the twilight. She'd been avoiding going back inside, where she'd have to face another night of serving drinks and dodging wandering hands. "You work in there?" Yates asked, nodding toward the swinging doors. "For now," Sarah replied, smoothing her skirts, "not by choice." "Few things out here are by choice, Miss Blackwood." He removed his hat, revealing sandy hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Most of us are running from something or toward something." "And which are you?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Yates looked out at the darkening street, his profile strong against the fading light. "Been running so long I'm not rightly sure anymore." He turned those blue eyes back to her. "But I get the feeling you're running from something pretty fierce." Sarah's breath caught. This stranger had somehow seen right through her carefully constructed facade. 6 weeks ago, she'd fled Boston in the dead of night, leaving behind a prominent fiancé whose charming public persona masked a cruel and violent private nature. The bruises had faded, but the fear remained. "I'm simply trying to make my way west," she said carefully. "San Francisco eventually." Long journey for a woman alone. "I've managed thus far." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "Redemption Creek's not the safest stop along the way. Town's changed since the silver started running dry." As if to punctuate his point, the saloon doors burst open, and a burly man staggered out, his face flushed with whiskey and anger. Sarah tensed, recognizing Frank Mallory, the saloon owner who'd made it clear her employment included expectations beyond serving drinks, expectations she'd repeatedly rebuffed. "There you are," Mallory bellowed. "Customers waiting, girl, ain't paying you to sit pretty outside." Before Sarah could respond, Yates was on his feet, his posture relaxed, but somehow radiating danger. "Evening," he said pleasantly, though there was steel beneath the greeting. Mallory squinted at the cowboy, trying to place him. "This ain't your business, stranger." "Just having a conversation with the lady," Yates replied. "Seems to me she's entitled to catch her breath before returning to work." Sarah stood, her heart racing. "It's all right," she said quietly to Yates. "I should go in." Mallory's meaty hand closed around her wrist. "Damn right you should." In a movement so swift Sarah barely registered it, Yates had stepped between them, breaking Mallory's grip with a twist that made the larger man wince. "Hands to yourself," Yates said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable promise of violence. Mallory backed up a step, reevaluating the cowboy. You new in town, don't recall seeing you before. Just passing through, Yates replied. Looking for work, actually. Sarah watched the exchange with her breath held. She'd witnessed enough saloon confrontations to know how quickly they could turn deadly. Well, pass through faster, Mallory snarled. And you, he turned to Sarah, get inside now or find yourself another job and another room. With that, he stormed back into the saloon, the doors swinging wildly behind him. Sarah exhaled slowly. Thank you, but that wasn't necessary. I can handle Frank Mallory. Yates settled his hat back on his head. No doubt you can, Miss Blackwood. But nobody should have to handle being manhandled. He looked at the saloon thoughtfully. How much does he pay you? $3 a week plus room and board, Sarah replied, puzzled by the question. Yates whistled low. Highway robbery, considering what those places typically bring in. He turned his gaze back to her. What if I offered you a different job, one that gets you closer to San Francisco? Sarah stiffened. She'd heard such offers before, and they rarely ended well for women in her position. What sort of job? Legitimate work, he assured her, seeming to read her suspicion. I'm driving a herd to Sacramento. Cook quit 2 days back, and 20 cowboys get mighty ornery without decent meals. You want me to cook for 20 cowboys? Sarah couldn't hide her disbelief. Can you cook? Well, yes, but pays $15 a week plus safe passage west, Yates continued. You'd have your own wagon and my personal guarantee of protection. Sarah studied him carefully. Every instinct told her to be wary of such an offer from a man she'd just met. Yet something about Yates Morgan's direct gaze made her want to trust him. Why would you offer this to a complete stranger? She asked. Yates shrugged. Call it a hunch. You don't strike me as someone who belongs serving whiskey to minors. Besides, he added with a small smile, the last batch of biscuits my trail hand made nearly broke a man's tooth. Despite herself, Sarah laughed. The sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she genuinely laughed. I leave at first light, Yates said. Cattle drives camped just north of town. You decide you want the job, be at the general store at dawn. He tipped his hat again. Think on it, Miss Blackwood. Sarah watched him walk away, his tall figure cutting a straight path through the gathering darkness. The proposition was both terrifying and tempting. Cooking for a cattle drive meant hard work, but would get her hundreds of miles closer to her destination and away from Frank Mallory's increasingly aggressive advances. Later that night, as she served whiskey to the usual crowd of miners and drifters, Sarah felt Mallory's eyes following her. When the saloon finally emptied in the early morning hours, he cornered her as she cleaned the last of the tables. That cowboy offer you something? He demanded, his breath sour with liquor. Just conversation, Sarah replied evenly, though her heart pounded. Mallory stepped closer. You've been holding out on me, Sarah. Time to show some gratitude for the job and room I've provided. His hand reached for her waist, and Sarah stepped back quickly. Mr. Mallory, I've been clear about our arrangement. Arrangements change, he growled, advancing again. Sarah's back hit the wall and panic flared in her chest. She'd been in this position before in Boston and had sworn never again. They certainly do, she said, her voice steady despite her fear. I quit. Mallory's face darkened. You what? I quit, Sarah repeated, ducking beneath his arm and moving toward the stairs that led to her small room. I'll be gone by morning. You ungrateful little, Mallory lunged for her, but his drunken state made him clumsy. Sarah darted up the stairs, locking her door behind her. With shaking hands, she pulled her carpet bag from beneath the narrow bed and began packing her few possessions. The journal went in first, followed by a carefully wrapped daguerreotype of her parents, 2 dresses, and the small derringer her father had insisted she take when she left home at 18. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Sarah had packed her belongings and slipped quietly down the back stairs of the saloon. Mallory would be sleeping off his night of drinking, giving her time to escape. The morning air was crisp as she made her way toward the general store, her decision made. She found Yates Morgan leaning against a hitching post, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. He straightened when he saw her approach, carpet bag in hand. You decided, he said simply. Sarah nodded. I can make biscuits that won't break any teeth. A slow smile spread across his face. Never doubted it for a minute. He took her bag, his fingers brushing hers briefly. Trail's rough, Miss Blackwood, sure you're up for it. Sarah looked back at the town of Redemption Creek, then to the open country beyond. I'm certain, Mr. Morgan. Yates, he corrected. Out on the trail, formality is the first thing we leave behind. Yates, she repeated, testing the name. Then I'm Sarah. He nodded, helping her up into a waiting wagon. Welcome to the Wybarm Cattle Drive, Sarah. Hope you don't mind dust, because we've got about 500 miles of it ahead. As they left Redemption Creek behind, Sarah felt a curious mixture of trepidation and hope. She knew nothing about this man or the journey ahead, but for the first time since fleeing Boston, she felt the faintest stirring of possibility, like a bird long caged, suddenly glimpsing open sky. The cattle drive stretched across the landscape like a living river, 500 head of longhorn cattle moving slowly northward under the watchful eyes of Yates's cowboys. Sarah quickly settled into a routine, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast for the hungry men, then packing up the chuck wagon to move with the herd. By midday, she would have ridden ahead to set up for the noon meal, and again in the evening to prepare supper. It was exhausting work, but Sarah found unexpected satisfaction in it. The cowboys were initially wary of her presence, but her quiet efficiency and the marked improvement in their meals soon won them over. On the fourth night, as the men sat around the campfire savoring her beef stew, Yates settled on the log beside her. You're not what I expected, he admitted, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Sarah glanced at him. What did you expect? Someone who'd complain more, he said with a slight smile. Trail life isn't easy, especially for someone used to town comforts. I wouldn't call working at Mallory's a comfort, Sarah replied, stirring the coals with a stick. Besides, I grew up on a farm in Massachusetts. Hard work isn't new to me. Yates studied her in the firelight. What brought you west then, if you don't mind my asking? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering how much to reveal. I was engaged, she finally said, to a prominent man in Boston, Charles Harrington. He wasn't who he pretended to be. Sarah's fingers unconsciously touched her ribs where the worst of the bruises had been. When I tried to break the engagement, he made it clear he wouldn't accept my decision. Understanding darkened Yates's eyes. So you ran. I left, Sarah corrected firmly. There's a difference. Yates nodded slowly. Fair enough. He looked out at the dark prairie stretching around them. What's in San Francisco? A fresh start, Sarah said. My mother's sister lives there. She wrote years ago about opportunities for educated women teaching positions, clerical work. You're educated then? Sarah smiled slightly. My father believed daughters should learn as much as sons. I taught school for 2 years before. She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the circumstances that had led to her engagement. Yates seemed to understand. Well, you're certainly teaching my men something about decent food. Thompson actually took his hat off before eating tonight. Never seen that before. Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the camp and drawing glances from several cowboys. One of them, a young man barely out of his teens who'd introduced himself as Riley, called over. Miss Sarah, would you mind awful much sharing that story you mentioned about the steamboat race? Soon, several cowboys had gathered closer, eager for entertainment to break the monotony of the trail. Sarah found herself recounting a tale her grandfather had told her about a famous race on the Mississippi, embellishing details to make the cowboys laugh. As the days passed, these evening gatherings became a tradition. Sometimes Sarah would tell stories, other times the men would share their own tales or teach her trail songs. Yates rarely joined in but would sit slightly apart, watching with an expression Sarah couldn't quite decipher. One evening, about 2 weeks into the journey, a spring storm rolled in with frightening speed. The cattle grew restless as lightning split the sky, and Yates ordered everyone to secure the camp and prepare for a potentially difficult night. Storm like this could spook the herd, he explained to Sarah as he helped her lash down the chuck wagon's canvas cover. If they stampede, we could lose weeks of work or worse. The rain began falling in heavy sheets, driven by fierce winds that bent the prairie grass flat. Sarah struggled to secure her cooking equipment as water sluiced across the ground beneath the wagon. "Get in the wagon," Yates shouted over the storm's roar. "Stay there until this passes." But before Sarah could climb inside, a blinding flash of lightning struck nearby, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder. The cattle reacted immediately, bellowing in panic. The sound of hundreds of hooves pounding the wet earth filled the air as the herd began to run. Stampede. Someone yelled and cowboys scrambled for their horses. In the chaos, Sarah lost her footing on the muddy ground. She fell hard, the breath knocked from her lungs as rain pelted her face. Disoriented, she tried to stand, only to realize with horror that the panicked cattle were heading in her direction. Suddenly, strong arms lifted her. Yates had appeared beside her, his face grim with determination as he swung her onto his horse and mounted behind her in one fluid motion. He kicked the animal into a gallop, moving them away from the path of the stampeding herd. Sarah clung to the saddle horn, acutely aware of Yates's arm around her waist, holding her securely as they rode through the storm. They reached higher ground and turned to watch as the cowboys worked to contain the stampede, gradually turning the lead cattle in a wide circle. "Will they be able to stop them?" Sarah asked, raising her voice above the storm. "Eventually," Yates answered, his breath warm against her ear. "My men know what they're doing." They sat on the horse, rain soaking them both, watching the skillful work of the cowboys. Gradually, the herd's panic subsided, and the dangerous energy of the stampede dissipated into exhausted milling. Only then did Sarah become fully aware of how intimately they were positioned, her back pressed against Yates's chest, his arm still firm around her waist. She felt a different kind of panic rising within her and shifted slightly. Yates immediately loosened his hold. "You're hurt," he said, noting how she winced. "Just bruised, I think," Sarah replied, though her side ached fiercely where she'd fallen. He guided the horse back toward camp, which was now a mud-soaked mess. The chuck wagon had held firm, though much of the camp was in disarray. Yates helped Sarah down, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. "Let me check that injury," he said, his voice gruff with concern. "It's nothing," Sarah insisted, suddenly self-conscious. Yates's expression hardened slightly. "I've seen men die from nothing injuries that festered. Now, let me see." In the wagon's shelter, Sarah reluctantly allowed him to examine her side, turning away and lifting her blouse just enough to reveal an angry red scrape and what would surely become a significant bruise. His fingers were surprisingly gentle as they probed the injury. "Doesn't feel like anything's broken," he said finally, "but that needs cleaning." He found her medical supplies and carefully tended the wound, his focus absolute. Sarah watched his face, noticing for the first time a thin scar that ran along his jawline, partially hidden by stubble. "How did you get that?" she asked, partly to distract herself from his touch. Yates's hands paused momentarily. "Disagreement with a man in Abilene, few years back." "What kind of disagreement?" A shadow crossed his face. "The kind that ends with one man walking away and one man not." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a flutter of apprehension. She'd suspected Yates Morgan had a past most men on the frontier did, but this was the first confirmation that violence was part of it. "Does that frighten you?" he asked, correctly reading her expression. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I've learned that all men are capable of violence, Mr. Morgan. The question is what provokes it and how they carry it afterward." Yates finished bandaging her side in silence. When he spoke again, his voice was low. He was beating a saloon girl, not the first time from what folks said. His eyes met hers, unflinching. "I don't regret it." Sarah held his gaze. "I wouldn't expect you to." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of understanding, perhaps, or the first fragile threads of trust being woven. The storm continued through the night, forcing a day's delay while they regrouped and attended to injured cattle. Sarah worked alongside the cowboys, helping where she could despite her own discomfort. She noticed Yates watching her frequently, his expression thoughtful. That evening, with the storm finally past and a clear sky overhead, Yates approached as she prepared a simple supper from their remaining supplies. "We lost 8 head," he reported, "but it could have been worse. No men injured seriously." "That's good news," Sarah said, stirring the pot of beans. Yates hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about what you said, about men and violence." Sarah looked up, surprised by the personal turn in conversation. "I've known my share of violent men," he continued. "Been one myself at times, but there's a difference between violence born of cruelty and violence born of necessity." He met her eyes directly. "I want you to know which kind I am." "I think I already do," Sarah replied softly. Yates nodded, seemingly satisfied. "We move out at first light. Trail gets rougher from here. We'll be hitting mountain country soon." He turned to leave, then paused. "You're doing well, Sarah, better than most seasoned hands their first drive." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you for taking a chance on me." "Way I see it," Yates said with the ghost of a smile, "I'm the one who got lucky. Never eaten so well on a cattle drive." As he walked away to check on the herd, Sarah found herself watching him longer than necessary, noting the way the cowboys deferred to him with respect rather than fear. It occurred to her that in the weeks since leaving Redemption Creek, she hadn't once felt the knot of anxiety that had become her constant companion since fleeing Boston. The realization was both comforting and troubling. Comforting because the constant fear had exhausted her, troubling because she recognized the dangerous territory her heart was entering. Attachments were luxuries she couldn't afford, not when San Francisco and her new life awaited. Yet as the campfire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, Sarah found herself wondering what kind of life she truly wanted, and whether the path she'd chosen was the only way forward. The cattle drive continued northward, crossing into more challenging terrain as they approached the Sierra Nevada foothills. The days grew warmer and the work harder, but the routine had become familiar to Sarah. She found herself enjoying the simplicity of trail life, the clear purpose each day brought, the satisfaction of work well done, and the camaraderie that had developed among the small community. She'd also begun to notice subtle changes in her interactions with Yates. He sought her company more frequently, finding reasons to check on the chuck wagon or assist with tasks that didn't strictly require his attention. Their conversations had grown easier, ranging from practical matters of the trail to more personal exchanges about their pasts. Sarah learned that Yates had been born in Tennessee but had headed west after the war, where he'd worked as a ranch hand before saving enough to buy his own small spread in Wyoming territory. This cattle drive was a contract job to deliver beef to Sacramento, with the profits intended to expand his ranch. "Not much for fancy living," he'd explained one evening as they sat by the fire after the other men had turned in. "But there's something about having land of your own. Something that grounds a man." "My father felt the same about our farm," Sarah had replied. "He used to say a person needs roots and wings, both roots to know where they belong and wings to take them there." Yates had studied her in the firelight. "And which are you using now, Sarah?" "Your roots or your wings?" The question had lingered with her for days afterward. Nearly a month into the journey, they made camp near a small river, a welcome chance for the men to bathe and for Sarah to properly wash clothes that had seen too much trail dust. Yates announced they would rest for a full day, giving both cattle and cowboys a needed break before the more difficult mountain crossing ahead. Sarah took advantage of the opportunity to explore the riverbank, walking upstream until she found a secluded pool where she could bathe in privacy. The cool water was blissful after weeks of makeshift washing, and she lingered longer than she'd intended, letting the gentle current soothe her trail-weary body. As she dressed and began to gather her things, she heard a rustling in the brush nearby. Tensing, she reached for the small derringer she'd taken to carrying in her pocket. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just me, madam," came an unfamiliar voice, and a man emerged from the trees, not one of Yates's cowboys, but a stranger with a scraggly beard and dirty clothes. He was followed by a second man, equally unkempt. "Don't mean to startle you." Sarah's hand tightened on her hidden gun. "You're trespassing on a private camp," the first man chuckled. "Now, that's not friendly, we're just travelers, same as you." His eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Saw your cattle drive from a distance, thought we might trade for some supplies. You should speak with Mr. Morgan," Sarah said firmly. "He's back at the main camp." "Oh, we will," the second man said, moving to block her path back downstream. "But seems like a stroke of luck, finding a lady all alone first. Been a while since we had female company." Sarah drew the derringer then, pointing it steadily. "Stay back." The men exchanged glances, clearly reassessing the situation. "Now, no need for that," the first man said, raising his hands slightly but not retreating. "We're just being friendly." "Your idea of friendly isn't welcome," Sarah replied. "Move aside." The second man's hand drifted toward his belt. "That little gun can only shoot one of us, lady." "Then I'll have to choose carefully," Sarah said, hoping they couldn't hear the fear in her voice. "Or you could choose neither," came Yates's voice from behind the men. They whirled to find him standing there, rifle raised casually but unmistakably aimed at them. Two of his cowboys flanked him, similarly armed. "This doesn't concern you," the first drifter said, though his bravado had diminished considerably. "Actually, it does," Yates replied conversationally. "See, this lady works for me, which makes her safety very much my concern." His eyes hardened. "I suggest you gentlemen continue your travels elsewhere." After a tense moment, the drifters backed away, muttering curses but clearly unwilling to test Yates and his men. They disappeared into the trees, the sound of their retreat fading quickly. Sarah lowered her derringer, her hand trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. Yates approached her, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Sarah nodded, tucking the small gun away. Nothing happened." "Riley, Thompson," Yates addressed the cowboys, "make sure our visitors keep moving, then check the perimeter of camp. I want guards posted tonight." The men nodded and headed off, leaving Yates and Sarah alone by the river. "How did you know?" she asked. "Saw them skulking around earlier," Yates explained. "Didn't like the look of them, so I kept an eye out." He hesitated. "I wasn't spying on you, just watching the area." "I'm glad you were," Sarah said sincerely. She looked at the small gun in her hand. "I'm not sure I could have actually fired this if I needed to." Yates's expression softened. "Based on how steady you were holding it, I think you would have done what was necessary." He gazed downstream toward their camp. "Still, might be best if you don't wander off alone while we're on the trail." Sarah bristled slightly at the implied restriction of her freedom. "I can take care of myself, Mr. Morgan." "Yates," he corrected automatically. "And yes, I believe you can, but even my most experienced cowboys travel in pairs out here. It's not about capability, it's about practicality." Sarah recognized the wisdom in his words, though it frustrated her to acknowledge another limitation on her independence. She'd left Boston to escape a man who sought to control her. The last thing she wanted was to trade one form of confinement for another. As if reading her thoughts, Yates added, "It's not about controlling you, Sarah. It's about keeping you safe until you reach your destination." Something flickered in his eyes. "San Francisco isn't far now, another 2 weeks, maybe less." The reminder of their journey's end brought an unexpected pang. Sarah had been so focused on the daily routine of the trail that she'd almost forgotten its purpose to deliver her to a new life far from Yates Morgan and his cattle drive. "Yes," she said, forcing brightness into her tone. "I should write to my aunt, let her know I'll be arriving soon." They walked back to camp in companionable silence, though Sarah sensed something had shifted again between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the temporary nature of their association. That night, Sarah lay awake in her small tent, listening to the sounds of the camp, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft conversation of the men on watch, the rustle of wind through the trees. She thought about San Francisco and the life that awaited her there. It had been her goal for so long, her beacon of hope during the darkest days in Boston and the difficult weeks at Mallory's Saloon. Yet now, with that goal almost within reach, she found herself hesitating, like a traveler who suddenly realizes the destination might not hold what they've been seeking after all. The next morning brought clear skies and the continued preparations for the mountain crossing ahead. Yates gathered the men after breakfast to discuss the route, while Sarah went about her usual tasks of packing the chuck wagon and planning meals with their dwindling supplies. "We'll need to restock before we hit the high country," she told Yates when he approached the wagon. "Flour's running low and we're almost out of coffee," Yates nodded. "There's a trading post about a day's ride from here. We can stop there." He hesitated, then added, "I was thinking you might want to stay behind when we cross the mountains." Sarah looked up sharply. "Stay behind, why?" "Mountain crossing is the most dangerous part of the drive," he explained. "Narrow trails, steep drops, unpredictable weather. I could arrange passage for you with a stage heading west from the trading post. Would be faster and safer than staying with the herd." Sarah studied him, trying to discern his true motivation. Was he concerned for her safety, or had she become a burden he wished to be rid of? "Is that what you want?" she asked directly. Yates met her gaze. "What I want and what's best aren't always the same thing. That's not an answer." He sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. "No, it's not what I want. But this was never about what I want, was it? It was about getting you safely to San Francisco." The honesty in his response touched something deep within Sarah. "I'd prefer to finish what I started," she said quietly, "unless you feel I've become a hindrance to the drive." "A hindrance?" Yates looked genuinely surprised. "Sarah, you've become essential." "The men are working harder, fighting less, all because they don't want to disappoint Miss Sarah. Morale's never been better on a drive." His voice softened. "But I wouldn't forgive myself if something happened to you crossing those mountains." "And I wouldn't forgive myself for taking the easy path when others are taking the difficult one," Sarah countered. "I made a commitment to this drive, Yates. I intend to honor it." A slow smile spread across his face. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Sarah Blackwood." "I believe the word you're looking for is determined," she replied with a smile of her own. Yates laughed, a full, rich sound that made several nearby cowboys turn in surprise. "Determined it is," he conceded, replacing his hat. "Just promise me you'll be careful in the mountains. Do exactly as I say when the trail gets dangerous." "I promise," Sarah agreed, then added impulsively, "and you promise to stop treating me like I might break at any moment." Yates considered this, then extended his hand as if to seal a business deal. "Fair enough." Sarah took his hand, expecting a quick shake. Instead, Yates held her fingers gently, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. The simple touch sent warmth spreading through her, and she found herself unable to look away from his intense blue gaze. "We have a deal, then," he said softly, finally releasing her hand. As he walked away to rejoin the cowboys, Sarah remained still, her hand tingling where he'd touched it. The strange mixture of emotions he evoked in her safety and danger, comfort and excitement, was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. That evening, as they made camp for the last night before reaching the trading post, Sarah found herself watching Yates as he worked with the men, his quiet authority evident in every interaction. She'd met many types of men in her 24 years, the polished gentlemen of Boston society, the rough miners of Redemption Creek, the hard-working cowboys of the drive, but none had affected her the way Yates Morgan did. It wasn't merely his handsome features or his protective nature, though both were undeniably appealing. It was something more fundamental, the sense that beneath his rugged exterior was a man of principle, a man whose word meant something in a world where promises were too often broken. As the campfire burned low and the cowboys began turning in for the night, Yates approached with 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might want this," he said, handing her one. "Getting cooler at night as we gain elevation." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring its warmth between her palms. "Thank you." Yates settled beside her on the log that served as a bench. For a while they sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the night sounds of the prairie giving way to the foothills. "Can I ask you something personal?" Yates finally said. Sarah nodded, curious. "This man in Boston, your fiancé, you loved him once?" The question caught her off guard. "I thought I did," she answered honestly. "Charles was charming, educated, from a good family. My parents were pleased with the match." But Sarah stared into her coffee. But I didn't really know him, not until we were engaged and he began to change, or perhaps he simply stopped hiding who he truly was. She took a deep breath. The first time he hit me, I told myself it was an aberration, that he'd been drinking, that he was under pressure from his business. The second time, I made more excuses. By the third time, I knew it would never stop. Yates's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. When I tried to break the engagement, he threatened to ruin my family's reputation, to spread rumors that would destroy my father's business. Then Sarah's voice faltered. He made it clear that I belonged to him, whether I wished it or not. So you left, Yates said softly. Sarah nodded. In the middle of the night, with what I could carry. I wrote to my parents from Pittsburgh, but I've been careful not to leave a trail. Charles has connections. If he's looking for me, I don't want to be found. Yates was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the firelight. No one will find you on this cattle drive, he finally said, his voice carrying an unmistakable promise. And if anyone tried, they'd have to go through me first. The simple declaration, spoken without drama or expectation, touched Sarah deeply. Thank you, she whispered. Yates looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the flames. Sarah, a sudden commotion from the cattle interrupted whatever he had been about to say. One of the night guards called out, and Yates was on his feet immediately, his hand going to the revolver at his hip. Stay here, he instructed, then strode quickly toward the source of the disturbance. Sarah watched anxiously as Yates conferred with the guards, their silhouettes dark against the starlit sky. After several tense minutes, he returned to the fire. Wolves, he explained. Small pack, probably drawn by the scent of the herd. Guards fired a few shots to scare them off. He glanced back toward the cattle. We'll double the watch tonight just to be safe. Will they come back? Possibly. Wolves are smart, they'll test us, looking for weakness. Yates smiled slightly. But so are my men, the cattle will be fine. Sarah nodded, relieved but also disappointed by the interruption of their conversation. Whatever Yates had been about to say seemed lost in the moment's passing. I should get some rest, she said, rising from the log. Early start tomorrow. Yates nodded. I'll be up with the guard shift for a while. He hesitated, then added, Sleep well, Sarah. As she made her way to her tent, Sarah couldn't help wondering what might have been said if the wolves hadn't interrupted. The question followed her into sleep, where her dreams were filled with blue eyes and unspoken words. The next day brought them to the trading post, a sturdy log building situated at a crossroads where several trails converged. It was the first sign of civilization they'd encountered in weeks, and the cowboys were eager for fresh supplies and perhaps news from the wider world. While Yates negotiated for the provisions they needed, Sarah browsed the trading post's limited selection of goods. Her eye was caught by a simple silver hair comb adorned with a delicate pattern of leaves, a small luxury she couldn't justify but admired nonetheless. Pretty thing, the trader's wife commented, noticing Sarah's interest. Came all the way from San Francisco. My husband got it last time he went for supplies. It's lovely, Sarah agreed, reluctantly setting it back on the counter. Later, as they prepared to leave the trading post and continue their journey, Yates approached with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Got something for you, he said, looking almost shy as he handed it to her. Puzzled, Sarah unwrapped the package to find the silver comb nestled inside. She looked up at Yates in surprise. I saw you looking at it, he explained. Thought you might like something. I don't know, something pretty after all these weeks of dust and trail food. Sarah ran her fingers over the delicate silver leaves, touched beyond words by the unexpected gift. Yates, I can't accept this. It's too much. It's not much at all, he insisted. Just a small thank you for all you've done for the drive. When she still hesitated, he added, Please, it would mean a lot to me if you'd have it. Unable to refuse the genuine warmth in his eyes, Sarah nodded. Thank you, it's beautiful. On impulse, she removed her bonnet and used the comb to pin back a section of her hair, which had grown longer during the journey. Yates watched the simple act with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. Suits you, he said quietly. The moment was broken by Riley calling from the chuck wagon, asking about the placement of the new supplies. Yates reluctantly turned his attention back to the practical matters of the drive, but Sarah caught him glancing her way several times as they prepared to move out. That night, as they made camp in the foothills proper, with the looming mountains visible on the horizon, Sarah found herself touching the silver comb often, each time remembering the look in Yates's eyes when he'd given it to her. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the emotional distance she tried to preserve throughout the journey. Despite her best intentions, Yates Morgan had somehow slipped past her carefully constructed defenses, awakening feelings she'd thought safely buried after her experience with Charles. The realization was frightening. In less than 2 weeks, they would reach Sacramento. She would continue to San Francisco, and Yates would return to his ranch in Wyoming. Their paths, which had crossed so unexpectedly outside that saloon in Redemption Creek, would diverge again, this time permanently. The thought brought an unexpected ache. Sarah had become so focused on reaching San Francisco that she hadn't considered what or whom she might be leaving behind. As the cattle drive began its ascent into the mountains the following day, the trail narrowed and grew steeper. Yates rode back and forth along the line, ensuring that the herd maintained a steady pace without bunching too closely together, a dangerous situation on the narrow mountain paths. Sarah drove the chuck wagon carefully, following the trail blazed by the lead riders. The views were spectacular, vast forests stretching below them, snow-capped peaks rising in the distance, but the beauty was tempered by the very real dangers of the crossing. On the third day in the mountains, disaster nearly struck. A section of trail, weakened by spring runoff, gave way beneath the wheels of the chuck wagon. Sarah felt the wagon lurch sickeningly to one side, teetering on the edge of a steep drop. She clung to the seat, heart pounding, as the wagon settled at a precarious angle. "Don't move." Yates shouted, having seen the danger from further up the trail. He rode quickly to her side, dismounting before his horse had fully stopped. "Stay exactly where you are." Sarah remained frozen in place as Yates carefully assessed the situation. The right wheels of the wagon had slipped over the trail's edge, leaving it balanced precariously on the left wheels and the wagon bed. "I'm going to get you out first," Yates said calmly, though Sarah could see the tension in his face. "Then we'll worry about the wagon." Several cowboys had gathered now, and under Yates's direction, they secured ropes to the far side of the wagon to prevent it from tipping further. Only then did Yates reach for Sarah. "Take my hand," he instructed. "Move slowly and keep your weight toward the hillside." Sarah did as he directed, carefully shifting toward him. As she reached for his outstretched hand, the wagon groaned and shifted slightly. Yates lunged forward, catching her around the waist and pulling her clear of the wagon just as it slipped further off the trail. They landed together on the rocky path, Yates taking the brunt of the fall with Sarah held protectively against his chest. For a moment they lay there, breathless from the narrow escape, Sarah acutely aware of Yates's arms around her and his heart pounding beneath her cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with concern. Sarah shook her head, too shaken to speak. Yates helped her sit up, his hands gentle but trembling slightly as he checked her for injuries. Satisfied that she was unharmed, he pulled her into a fierce embrace, his face buried in her hair. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered, so quietly she barely heard the words. Before Sarah could respond, he released her and turned his attention to the precariously balanced wagon. With the help of the cowboys and several yoke of oxen, they managed to secure the wagon and pull it back onto solid ground. Much of their supplies had been lost over the edge, but the wagon itself was salvageable. That evening, as they made camp on a relatively flat section of the mountain trail, Yates approached Sarah with a cup of the strong coffee she'd come to appreciate during their journey. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. "A bit shaken still," Sarah admitted, "but grateful to be in one piece." Yates nodded, his expression solemn. "We lost some supplies, but nothing we can't manage without. The important thing is that you're safe." The sincerity in his voice warmed Sarah more than the coffee. "Thank you for what you did today. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Sarah said firmly, "not anyone. They fell silent, watching as the cowboys moved about the camp, setting up for the night. The near disaster seemed to have affected everyone, creating a subdued atmosphere unusual for the typically boisterous group. "We should reach the summit tomorrow," Yates finally said. "After that, it's easier going down to the valley. 2 more days to Sacramento." The word hung between them, a reminder of their journey's approaching end. "Yates," Sarah began hesitantly. "I've been thinking." "Boss," Riley interrupted, hurrying toward them. "Rider coming up the trail. Looks like he's in a hurry." Yates was immediately alert. "One of ours?" "No, sir." "Stranger?" Yates nodded, his hand automatically checking the revolver at his hip. "Stay here," he told Sarah, then moved to meet the approaching rider. Sarah watched as a man on a lathered horse pulled up at the edge of their camp. He and Yates spoke briefly, the stranger gesturing back down the trail. After a few minutes, Yates handed the man something money, Sarah guessed, and the rider departed as quickly as he'd come. When Yates returned, his expression was grim. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Bad news." "Could be," Yates replied. "That was a scout for one of the stage lines. Says there's a man in Auburn asking questions about a cattle drive heading to Sacramento, specifically about whether there's a woman traveling with it." Sarah felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "Charles," she whispered. Yates nodded. "Description matches what you told me. Well-dressed Eastern man offering money for information. How did he find me?" Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. "I was so careful." "Doesn't matter now," Yates said firmly. "What matters is keeping you away from him." "But Auburn is on our route to Sacramento," Sarah realized. "We'll have to pass through it." "You won't," Yates decided. "I'm sending you with Thompson and Riley on an alternate trail. It's longer but avoids the main settlements. You'll meet us in Sacramento after we deliver the herd." "No," Sarah said, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I won't run anymore." Yates stared at her. "Sarah, this man hurt you. He's clearly determined to find you." "Exactly," she replied, a new resolve strengthening her voice. "And if I keep running, he'll keep chasing. It has to end somewhere." She met Yates's concerned gaze steadily. "I'm tired of living in fear, Yates. What are you suggesting? I'll continue with the drive. If Charles is in Auburn, let him find me surrounded by 20 cowboys who won't let him near me." Yates considered this, clearly conflicted. "It's risky. Men like that don't give up easily." "Neither do I," Sarah said with quiet determination. "And neither do you, I think." A slow smile spread across Yates's face. "No, I suppose I don't." He looked at her with newfound respect. "All right, we stick together. But you stay close to me when we reach Auburn. Understand?" Sarah nodded, relieved and somehow exhilarated by the decision to stand her ground. For the first time since fleeing Boston, she felt as though she was reclaiming control of her life rather than merely reacting to circumstances. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Sarah sat by the fire, lost in thought. The knowledge that Charles was so close, still pursuing her after all these months, should have terrified her. Instead, she felt an unexpected calm, as if the confrontation she'd been dreading and avoiding was necessary for her to truly move forward. She heard footsteps approaching and looked up to find Yates returning from his final check of the camp perimeter. He settled beside her, his shoulder brushing hers in the chill mountain air. "You should get some rest," he said gently. "Big day tomorrow crossing the summit." "I know," Sarah replied. "I just needed some time to think." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Having second thoughts about Auburn?" "No," Sarah said firmly, "but I'm thinking about what comes after." "San Francisco," Yates said, a question in his tone. Sarah hesitated, then turned to face him directly. "When I left Boston, San Francisco was my only goal, my safe harbor. But now I'm not so sure that's where I'm meant to be." Yates grew very still beside her. "Where are you meant to be, Sarah?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But these past weeks have shown me that I'm stronger than I thought, that I can face challenges I never imagined." She looked at him meaningfully. That there might be different kinds of safe harbors in this world. Yates reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and touched the silver comb in her hair. "I've never met anyone like you, Sarah Blackwood," he said softly. When I found you sitting outside that saloon, I thought I was offering you a job. I didn't realize you'd be offering me something far more valuable." "What's that?" Sarah asked, her heart beating faster. "A glimpse of a different future," Yates replied, "one I hadn't let myself imagine before." The honesty in his voice left no doubt about his meaning. Sarah felt a surge of emotion, fear mingled with hope, caution battling with desire. "Yates," she began, uncertain what she wanted to say. He shook his head slightly. "You don't need to answer now. We have the summit to cross, a herd to deliver, and a man from your past to confront." His eyes held hers. "But when those things are behind us, I hope we might talk about what could lie ahead." Sarah nodded, a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation filling her. "I'd like that." Yates smiled, then leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender it brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Get some sleep," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll be nearby if you need anything." As Sarah watched him walk away, she touched the spot where his lips had brushed her skin. The simple contact had conveyed more genuine affection than she'd ever felt from Charles, even in the early days of their courtship. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to consider a possibility she'd kept firmly at bay throughout their journey, that the connection she felt with Yates Morgan might be the beginning of something deeper, something lasting. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Tomorrow they would cross the summit and begin their descent toward Auburn, where Charles waited. Beyond that lay Sacramento, the end of the cattle drive, and decisions that would shape the rest of her life. Sarah touched the silver comb once more, a talisman of possibility, then finally sought her tent and the rest she would need for the challenges ahead. The crossing of the summit proved less treacherous than anticipated, thanks to Yates's careful planning and the skill of his cowboys. By midday, they had reached the highest point of the trail, where Yates called a brief halt to rest the cattle and enjoy the spectacular view, the vast wilderness they had traversed stretching behind them, and the green Sacramento Valley visible in the distance ahead. "We made good time," Yates told Sarah as they stood together at a lookout point. "Should reach Auburn by tomorrow afternoon." Sarah nodded, her thoughts already turning to the confrontation that awaited her there. "Do you think he knows I'm with the drive for certain, or is he just following rumors?" "Hard to say," Yates replied, "but we'll be ready either way." He studied her face. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," Sarah said firmly, "just preparing myself." Yates's expression softened. "You're not facing him alone this time, Sarah. Remember that." The descent from the summit began smoothly, but as afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered over the western peaks. By evening, a steady rain had begun to fall, turning the trail muddy and treacherous. "We'll need to make camp early," Yates decided, finding a relatively sheltered area beneath a stand of pines. Trails too dangerous in this weather, especially with darkness coming. The cowboys worked quickly to secure the herd and establish camp before the worst of the storm hit. Sarah helped where she could, but the rain soon intensified, driven by gusting winds that made even the simplest tasks difficult. By the time they had rigged tarps for shelter and built fires that struggled against the downpour, everyone was soaked and miserable. Sarah served a hastily prepared stew, trying to boost morale with the hot food. "Never seen a storm blow in so fast up here," Riley commented as he huddled near the main fire. "Not this time of year." "Mountain weather," Yates replied, accepting a bowl from Sarah with a grateful nod. Unpredictable at best. As night fell, the storm intensified further. Lightning split the sky with increasing frequency, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very mountains. The cattle grew restless, despite the cowboys' efforts to keep them calm. Yates doubled the night watch, concerned about the combination of nervous cattle and treacherous conditions. "If this keeps up," he told Sarah, "we may need to delay our descent until the storm passes." "What about Auburn?" Sarah asked, thinking of Charles waiting there. "Better to arrive late than not at all," Yates said grimly. "This trail becomes a death trap in heavy rain." Sarah nodded, understanding the wisdom in his caution even as she chafed at the delay. The confrontation with Charles had taken on an almost mythical importance in her mind, a necessary step before she could truly move forward, with or without Yates. The thought of Yates brought her eyes to where he stood at the edge of camp, rain streaming from his hat brim as he peered into the darkness toward the herd. Despite the miserable conditions, there was something steadfast in his stance, a reliability that Sarah had come to depend on more than she'd realized. As if sensing her gaze, Yates turned and caught her watching him. Even across the rain-swept camp, the connection between them was palpable. He raised a hand in a small gesture that somehow conveyed both reassurance and affection. Sarah returned the gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them, something too fragile yet to name, but too powerful to deny. The storm continued through the night, with little sign of abating by morning. Yates gathered the cowboys after a cold breakfast to assess their situation. Trails washed out in several places, Thompson reported after scouting ahead. Saw at least one slide that's blocking the main path. Yates considered this information, his expression grave. Is the lower trail still passable? Looks that way, Thompson nodded. Longer route but safer in this weather. Then that's the way we'll go, Yates decided. It adds half a day to our journey, but better that than risking the herd or our necks on the main trail. The cowboys nodded in agreement, though Sarah noticed several glances of concern exchanged. The delay meant dwindling supplies and the potential for missing their delivery deadline in Sacramento. As the men dispersed to prepare for departure, Yates approached Sarah at the chuck wagon. The detour takes us further east of Auburn, he explained. We won't be going through town now. Sarah absorbed this information, feelings mixed. So I won't see Charles. Not unless he somehow learns of our route change, Yates confirmed. Does that disappoint you? Sarah considered the question carefully. Part of me wanted the confrontation, needed it, perhaps, to prove to myself that I'm not running away. She looked up at Yates. But another part is relieved. Does that make me a coward? No, Yates said firmly. It makes you wise. There's no courage in unnecessary risks, Sarah. His voice softened. Besides, confronting your past doesn't always mean confronting the person who hurt you. Sometimes it just means moving forward on your own terms. The simple wisdom of his words resonated deeply with Sarah. When did you get so philosophical, Yates Morgan? A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. Must be all those nights staring at the stars, wondering about things a simple cowboy has no business wondering about. You're many things, Sarah replied, but simple isn't one of them. Their gazes held for a long moment, the connection between them deepening despite or perhaps because of the challenges they faced together. The journey resumed, more difficult now with the rain-soaked trails and the longer route. Progress was slow but steady, the experienced cowboys guiding the herd with practiced skill despite the adverse conditions. By late afternoon, the storm had finally begun to subside, though the skies remained heavy with clouds. They made camp earlier than usual, everyone exhausted from the day's difficult travel. As Sarah prepared the evening meal, a thinner stew than usual, given their dwindling supplies, she noticed a group of riders approaching from the east. Her heart quickened with apprehension until she recognized the uniform of a U.S. Army patrol. Yates went to meet them, returning shortly with news. Lieutenant says there's a war party of renegade Miwok causing trouble in these foothills, raided a homestead 2 days back. He looked troubled. They've advised us to stick to our current route and keep extra guards on watch. The news cast a pall over the already weary camp. Extra vigilance meant less rest for men already pushed to their limits by the difficult conditions. How far are we from Sacramento now? Sarah asked as she served Yates his portion of stew. 3 days with this detour and the conditions, he replied. Maybe 4 if we hit more trouble. 4 more days. The realization that their journey was nearing its end brought that now familiar pang to Sarah's heart. Despite the hardships, despite the danger, she had found something on this cattle drive that had been missing from her life for too long, a sense of belonging, of purpose, and of genuine connection. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Sarah left her tent to sit by the dying embers of the fire. The rain had stopped completely now, and breaks in the clouds revealed stars scattered across the vast mountain sky. She was not entirely surprised when Yates joined her a short time later, returning from his rounds of the night guards. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, settling beside her. Sarah shook her head. "Too much on my mind, the Miwok?" "No," Sarah admitted. "Sacramento." Yates was quiet for a moment, poking at the embers with a stick. "You're still planning to continue to San Francisco?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "For so long that was the plan, the only plan, but now—" She turned to look at him directly. "Now I'm not sure what I want." Yates met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the glow of the embers. "What if I told you what I want?" Sarah's heart quickened. "I'd listen." He set aside the stick and took her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "I want you to come back to Wyoming with me, Sarah, not as my cook," he added with a small smile, "though God knows the men at the ranch would appreciate that, but as—" He hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. "As what?" Sarah prompted softly. "As my partner," Yates said simply. "In all things." The directness of his proposal took Sarah's breath away. There was no flowery language, no grand declarations, just a straightforward offer of a shared life. "Yates," she began, uncertain how to respond, "we've known each other such a short time." "I know," he acknowledged. "And I'm not asking for an answer tonight, or even when we reach Sacramento. I'm just asking you to consider it, to consider that maybe what we've found together these past weeks is worth building on." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his calloused and strong, her smaller but no less capable after weeks of trail work. "I care for you," she said carefully. "More than I thought possible after what happened with Charles, but I'm afraid—" "Of what?" Yates asked when she trailed off. "Of making another mistake, of trusting the wrong person again." Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's fair, you've been hurt badly." He squeezed her hand gently. "I can only tell you that I would never intentionally cause you pain, Sarah. And that whatever you decide, my respect for you won't change." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. This was not Charles with his practiced charm and hidden cruelty. This was Yates Morgan, straightforward, honorable, and genuine in a way Sarah had almost stopped believing men could be. "I'll think about it," she promised. "Truly?" Yates smiled, a warmth in his eyes that made Sarah's heart flutter. "That's all I ask." He hesitated, then leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, his lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. Unlike Charles's possessive, demanding kisses, this felt like a question one Sarah found herself answering as she leaned into the contact, her free hand coming up to rest against Yates's chest. The kiss deepened gradually, a slow exploration rather than a conquest. When they finally separated, both were breathing unevenly, and Sarah felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the nearby embers. "I should check the guards again," Yates said softly, reluctance evident in his voice. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He rose, still holding her hand, and pressed a final kiss to her knuckles before releasing her. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night," she whispered, watching as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the camp. Sarah remained by the fire long after Yates had gone, her mind and heart in turmoil. The kiss had awakened feelings she'd thought safely buried: desire, certainly, but also a deeper yearning for connection, for partnership, for a future shared rather than faced alone. Wyoming was not San Francisco. It would mean a life very different from what she had imagined for herself, a harder life in many ways, far from the civilized comforts of a city. But it would also mean building something real with a man she was coming to love, despite her best efforts to guard her heart. The realization that she was indeed falling in love with Yates Morgan both thrilled and terrified her. After Charles, she had sworn never to make herself vulnerable to a man again. Yet here she was, contemplating not just a romance but a life partnership with a man she'd known for barely 2 months. Was she being foolish? Or was she finally recognizing what genuine love looked like, not the theatrical passion Charles had displayed in public while harboring cruelty in private, but the steady, respectful care Yates had shown from the beginning? These questions followed Sarah into sleep when she finally sought her tent, and remained with her as they broke camp the next morning to continue their journey towards Sacramento. The day passed uneventfully, the cattle drive making steady progress along the alternate route. Yates didn't mention their conversation or the kiss they had shared, though Sarah often caught him watching her with a warmth in his eyes that made her cheeks flush. By evening, they had reached a valley where the trail widened, allowing for a more comfortable camp than they'd had in days. The weather had improved dramatically, with clear skies promising a dry night, a welcome change after the recent storms. As Sarah prepared the evening meal, stretching their dwindling supplies as best she could, she noticed a rider approaching from the direction they had come. Her first thought was of Charles, but as the rider drew closer, she recognized Thompson, who had been sent back to check on a section of the herd that had fallen behind. The expression on Thompson's face as he dismounted and hurried toward Yates sent a chill through Sarah. Something was wrong. She moved closer, catching fragments of their urgent conversation. At least 15 of them, Thompson was saying, armed with rifles. They've cut off the rear guard and part of the herd. Yates's expression hardened. Miwok, Thompson shook his head. White men organized. They know what they're doing. Rustlers, Yates said grimly. How far back? Less than an hour's ride. Riley and the others are trying to hold them off, but they're outnumbered. Yates made a quick decision. Gather 10 men, leave the rest here with the main herd. He turned and saw Sarah standing nearby. Sarah, stay here, keep everyone close to camp. What's happening? She asked, though she had pieced together most of it already. Cattle thieves, Yates explained tersely. They've cut off part of our herd, we're going back to deal with them. Sarah felt a flutter of fear. Is it dangerous? Could be, Yates admitted. These aren't ordinary rustlers if they're willing to take on a full cattle drive. Then let them have the cattle, Sarah said urgently. It's not worth risking lives. Yates's expression softened slightly. It's not just about the cattle, Sarah. Riley and 3 others are back there. I won't abandon my men. Of course he wouldn't. It was part of what made him the man. He was the man she was falling in love with. Be careful, she said, resisting the urge to reach for him. Yates nodded, his eyes conveying what words couldn't in the public setting. Lock yourself in the chuck wagon tonight. Keep that derringer close. Within minutes, Yates and his chosen men had ridden out, leaving the camp feeling suddenly vulnerable despite the remaining cowboys. Sarah went through the motions of serving the evening meal, but her appetite had vanished, replaced by a gnawing worry. Night fell with no sign of Yates and the others returning. Sarah secured herself in the chuck wagon as instructed, but sleep was impossible. Every sound, the rustle of wind through trees, the occasional lowing of cattle, the soft conversation of the guards had her tensing, expecting danger. It was well past midnight when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Sarah peered cautiously through a small window in the wagon, derringer in hand. Relief flooded her as she recognized Yates's tall figure dismounting wearily. She opened the wagon door and hurried toward him. In the moonlight, she could see that his shirt was torn and there was a dark stain on his sleeve that looked worryingly like blood. You're hurt, she said, reaching for him instinctively. It's nothing, Yates assured her, though he winced as she touched his arm. Bullet grazed me. Others got worse. Sarah looked beyond him to where the returning cowboys were dismounting. Most appeared unharmed, but 2 were being helped from their horses, clearly injured. What happened? She asked, already moving toward the injured men. Ambush, Yates replied, following her. They weren't just rustlers, they knew we were coming new our route. Sarah's hands stilled in the act of examining one cowboy's wounded shoulder. How is that possible? Yates's expression was grim. Someone told them, someone who knew we'd changed course after the storm. The implication hung in the air between them. Few people outside their own company had known about the route change. You think someone in Auburn? Sarah began, a terrible suspicion forming. I think your former fiancé is a resourceful man, Yates said quietly. And that he might have decided if he couldn't have you back, he'd make sure I paid a price for helping you. The idea that Charles might have orchestrated an attack that endangered so many lives that might have cost Yates his life filled Sarah with cold fury. We need to get these men patched up, she said, forcing herself to focus on the immediate need. Then we need to talk. With the help of the uninjured cowboys, Sarah treated the wounded men as best she could with their limited medical supplies. One had a bullet lodged in his thigh, another had been struck across the back with a rifle butt, leaving ugly bruising but no lasting damage. Yates's wound was indeed a graze, painful but not serious once cleaned and bandaged. When the injured were resting as comfortably as possible, Sarah and Yates withdrew to the chuck wagon to speak privately. "Tell me everything," she said, pouring him a cup of coffee laced with the medicinal whiskey they kept for emergencies. Yates took a long swallow before speaking. "They hit us just after sunset. Professional job, they'd scouted our position, knew exactly where to strike." His eyes met hers. "They weren't just after cattle, Sarah. Their leader specifically asked about the woman traveling with the drive." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Charles sent them." "I believe so," Yates nodded. "When they didn't find you with that section of the herd, things got ugly. They shot Cooper and Williams before we arrived." His jaw tightened. "We managed to drive them off, but not before they wounded James and Tucker." "And you," Sarah added softly, touching the bandage on his arm. Yates shrugged dismissively. "Like I said, it's nothing. It's not nothing," Sarah insisted. "Those men were hurt, could have been killed because of me, because I brought this danger to your drive." "No," Yates said firmly. "They were hurt because a man who claims to love you is so obsessed with controlling you that he's willing to hurt innocent people. That's not on you, Sarah. It's on him." Sarah looked away, guilt and anger warring within her. "What do we do now?" "We continue to Sacramento," Yates said. "But we change our plans. We won't all travel together, too obvious a target. I'll send the herd ahead with most of the men while you and I, plus Thompson and Riley, take a different route." "Split up," Sarah frowned. "Is that safe? Safer than staying together," Yates reasoned. "The herd is what those men will be watching for. 4 riders traveling separately won't attract the same attention." Sarah considered this, then nodded slowly. "When do we leave?" "First light," Yates decided. "We'll head west, then south, longer route but less likely to encounter trouble." The plan made sense, but Sarah couldn't shake her sense of responsibility for the danger facing them all. "Yates, I'm so sorry for bringing this on you." His expression softened and he reached across the small table to take her hand. "Sarah, listen to me. You have nothing to apologize for." "Nothing?" His eyes held hers intently. "If I had to do it all over again, finding you outside that saloon, offering you a job, everything that's happened since, I wouldn't change a thing. Not one moment." The simple sincerity in his voice moved Sarah deeply. Here was a man who had been shot at, whose friends had been injured, whose business was in jeopardy all because of her, and still he had no regrets. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why would you risk so much for someone you barely knew?" Yates's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Maybe at first it was just instinct, seeing someone who needed help and being able to offer it." His gaze never wavered from hers. "But now it's because I love you, Sarah Blackwood, and that makes everything else worth it." The declaration, spoken so plainly and honestly, left Sarah momentarily speechless. She had suspected, hoped even, that his feelings ran as deeply as her own. But to hear the words, to see the absolute certainty in his eyes, was overwhelming. "Yates, she began, but he shook his head slightly. "You don't need to say anything," he told her. "Not now, not with everything that's happening. I just wanted you to know." He squeezed her hand once more, then released it. "I should check on the men, make sure everything's set for tomorrow." As he rose to leave, Sarah found her voice. "Yates." He turned back, a question in his eyes. "I love you too," she said simply. "I think perhaps I have since that first day when you stood up to Frank Mallory without even knowing me." The smile that spread across Yates's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, warm and full of promise. He stepped back to her, cupped her face gently in his hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Then we'll figure this out," he promised against her lips. "Together." When Yates had gone to make preparations for their departure, Sarah remained in the chuck wagon, her mind racing with all that had happened and all that lay ahead. The realization that Charles had escalated to violence was terrifying, but it also clarified something for her. She would not allow fear to dictate her choices any longer. Not fear of Charles, not fear of an uncertain future, not even fear of opening her heart again after being hurt so deeply. Yates Morgan loved her. And she loved him not with the shallow infatuation she'd once felt for Charles, but with a deeper, truer feeling born of shared hardship, mutual respect, and genuine understanding. Whatever dangers lay ahead on the road to Sacramento, they would face them together. And beyond that, beyond Charles and his threats, beyond the cattle drive and its conclusion, there was the possibility of a future she had never imagined but now couldn't stop thinking about: Wyoming. A ranch. A life built with a man who saw her strength rather than seeking to break it. For the first time since fleeing Boston, Sarah felt not just hope but certainty. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she had found what she was truly seeking: not just safety or independence, but a love worth fighting for. Dawn broke clear and cool as they prepared for their separate journeys. The main herd would continue along the established trail toward Sacramento, while Sarah, Yates, Thompson, and Riley would take a less direct route, hoping to avoid further confrontation. As Sarah packed her few belongings, her hand lingered on the silver comb Yates had given her, a simple gift that had come to symbolize so much. She tucked it carefully into her pocket, a talisman for the journey ahead. The goodbyes were brief but heartfelt, the cowboys expressing genuine concern for her safety. Even James, propped up on his injured leg, insisted on shaking her hand. "You make sure the boss gets to Sacramento in one piece, Miss Sarah," he told her with a pained smile. "Never seen him so happy as he's been with you around." Sarah promised she would, touched by the loyalty these rough men showed not just to Yates but to her as well. Their small party set out as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, riding westward away from the main trail. Yates led the way, with Sarah following and Thompson and Riley bringing up the rear. They traveled mostly in silence, alert for any sign of danger. By midday, they had reached a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Yates called a brief halt to rest the horses and take stock of their surroundings. "No sign of pursuit," Thompson reported after scouting behind them. "Think we might have given them the slip." "For now," Yates nodded, though his expression remained vigilant. "We'll keep a careful pace. Better to arrive safely than quickly." As they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Sarah found herself studying the valley below them. In the distance, she could make out the faint outline of buildings, a small settlement of some kind. "What's that town?" she asked, pointing. Yates followed her gaze. "Auburn," he said after a moment, "or close enough to it." Sarah stared at the distant settlement, knowing that somewhere in those buildings Charles might be waiting, planning his next move. "We're going to skirt well around it," Yates assured her, noting her expression. "No need to go near." Sarah nodded, but something had shifted within her at the sight of the town. The confrontation she had both dreaded and strangely desired now seemed inevitable, a necessary conclusion to the chapter of her life that had begun with her flight from Boston. "Actually," she said slowly, "I think we should go to Auburn." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in surprise. "That would be walking right into his hands," Riley objected. "Not if he doesn't know we're coming," Sarah countered. "He's expecting us to stay with the herd, moving along the alternate trail. Auburn is the last place he'd look for us now." Yates studied her thoughtfully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that as long as Charles is hunting me, none of us will be safe," Sarah explained. "He's proven he's willing to hurt people to get to me. That won't change just because we reach Sacramento." "So what's your plan?" Thompson asked. Sarah took a deep breath. "I go to the law in Auburn, report Charles for organizing an armed attack on your cattle drive. With 3 witnesses, including one who was shot, they'd have to take it seriously." Yates considered this. "It might work," he admitted, "but it's risky. If Charles has influence there, he's an Easterner with money," Sarah acknowledged. "He might have bought cooperation. But it's still our best chance to end this once and for all." The men exchanged glances, weighing the proposition. "I don't like putting you anywhere near that man," Yates said finally, his concern evident. "I don't like it either," Sarah admitted, "but I'm tired of running, Yates." Tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of other people being hurt because of his obsession. She met his gaze directly. I want it to end, here, now. After a long moment, Yates nodded slowly. All right, but we do this carefully. Thompson and Riley will go ahead, scout the town. Make sure it's safe before we follow. The plan was agreed upon, and the two cowboys rode ahead toward Auburn while Yates and Sarah remained on the ridge, watching their progress through a small spyglass. Are you sure about this? Yates asked as they waited. Once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Sarah nodded, a sense of calm purpose settling over her. I'm sure, whatever happens in Auburn, I want to face it standing beside you, not running from it. Yates took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. Then we face it together. They remained on the ridge for several hours, waiting for Thompson and Riley to complete their reconnaissance of Auburn. The sun was beginning its westward descent when they finally saw the two cowboys returning, riding at an easy pace that suggested no immediate danger. Town seems quiet enough, Thompson reported when they rejoined Yates and Sarah. No sign of any large group of men that might be waiting for us. We asked around casual-like, Riley added. There is an Easterner staying at the hotel fancy dresser throwing money around. Matches the description of your former fiancé. Sarah's heart quickened at the confirmation that Charles was indeed in Auburn, but she maintained her resolve. Did you learn anything else? Sheriff's a man named Hollister, Thompson continued, seems decent enough from what folks say. Not the type to be bought easily. That's good news, Yates observed. Any sign that this Easterner has men with him? None that we could spot, Riley shook his head. But that doesn't mean they're not around. Yates considered this information carefully. All right, here's how we'll do this. We'll ride into town at dusk, less chance of being noticed. Go directly to the sheriff's office. If he's as straight as people say, we present our case and let the law handle it from there. The plan was simple but sound. As the sun began to set, they mounted up and rode toward Auburn, keeping to less traveled paths until they reached the outskirts of town. Auburn proved to be larger than it had appeared from a distance, a proper town with several streets, businesses, and a surprising number of people still about despite the approaching evening. The gold rush that had built the town might have waned, but it had left behind an established community. They made their way carefully to the sheriff's office, a solid building on the main street. Yates instructed Thompson and Riley to secure the horses while he and Sarah went inside. Sheriff Hollister was a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard and shrewd eyes that assessed them carefully as they entered his office. He listened to their story without interruption: the cattle drive, Sarah's flight from her abusive fiancé, the ambush that had injured several cowboys. Serious accusations, he said when they had finished. You have proof this Harrington fellow was behind the attack. One of the attackers specifically asked about the woman traveling with the drive, Yates explained. And Harrington has been asking about us all through the foothills, according to reports we've received. Hollister stroked his beard thoughtfully. Circumstantial but compelling. I'll bring him in for questioning. He looked at Sarah. You willing to face him, make these accusations directly? Sarah's throat tightened, but she nodded firmly. Yes, all right then. Hollister rose from his desk. Wait here. I'll send my deputy to fetch Mr. Harrington from the hotel. Should only take a few minutes. After the sheriff left, Yates moved to Sarah's side, taking her hand. You can still change your mind, he said quietly. We could leave now, continue to Sacramento. Sarah shook her head. No, I need to see this through. They waited in tense silence, the minutes stretching interminably. When the door finally opened, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Charles Harrington entered the sheriff's office with the confident stride of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He was exactly as Sarah remembered, handsome in a polished way, expensively dressed, his smile charming until one noticed the coldness in his eyes. Those eyes widened slightly when they fell on Sarah, a mixture of triumph and fury crossing his face before he masked it with practiced ease. Sarah, my dear, he said smoothly, I've been so worried about you. Sheriff Hollister closed the door behind them. Mr. Harrington, this lady has made some serious allegations against you. Care to respond? Charles's expression shifted to one of wounded innocence. Allegations? What sort of allegations? That you organized an armed attack on a cattle drive, resulting in injuries to several men, Hollister stated bluntly. All to get to Miss Blackwood here. Charles laughed, the sound as false as his smile. That's absurd. I've been searching for Sarah because she's my fiancé. She disappeared from Boston months ago. I feared she'd been abducted or worse. I left of my own accord, Sarah said, finding her voice at last, to escape you and your violence. Charles's eyes hardened momentarily before he regained his composure. Violence. Sarah, darling, you were always prone to exaggeration. We had disagreements, certainly, as all couples do, but violence. He shook his head sorrowfully. I fear you've been filling the sheriff's ear with falsehoods. The only falsehoods here are coming from you, Yates said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable threat. Charles's gaze shifted to him, assessing. And you are, Yates Morgan, owner of the cattle drive your men attacked. I assure you, Mr. Morgan, I have no idea what you're talking about, Charles replied smoothly. I'm a businessman from Boston, not some frontier outlaw. Sheriff Hollister watched the exchange with keen eyes. Mr. Harrington, can you account for your whereabouts yesterday? Certainly. I was here in Auburn all day, meeting with several local businessmen about potential investments. Charles smiled confidently. The hotel staff can confirm I didn't leave the premises. Convenient, Yates muttered. Charles ignored him, focusing on Sarah. My dear, this has gone on long enough. Your family is frantic with worry. Come home with me, and we can put this unfortunate episode behind us. Sarah felt a familiar fear rising within her at his tone, the same fear that had driven her to flee Boston. But this time, it was quickly replaced by anger. I am not your dear, she said firmly. I broke our engagement months ago, and I meant it. I will never return to Boston with you. Charles's facade slipped just for a moment, revealing the rage beneath. You don't have a choice, Sarah. You're making a scene, embarrassing yourself and your family. The only one embarrassing himself is you, Yates interjected. The lady has made her decision. Accept it and leave her be. Charles's eyes narrowed. This doesn't concern you, Cowboy. Actually, it does, Yates replied evenly. Sarah is under my protection. A nasty smile spread across Charles's face. Ah, I see. You found yourself a new protector, Sarah. How? Predictable. Before Sarah could respond, the office door opened again and Thompson entered hurriedly. Sheriff, he said, glancing warily at Charles, there are 4 men outside who match the description of those who attacked our herd. Hollister straightened. You sure? Positive, Thompson nodded. Riley's keeping an eye on them. Charles's expression remained neutral, but Sarah detected a flicker of unease in his eyes. Interesting timing, Hollister commented, reaching for his gun belt. Mr. Harrington, I think you'd better stay right here while I investigate this. This is absurd, Charles protested. You can't possibly believe I can and do, Hollister cut him off. Miss Blackwood's story is straightforward. Yours keeps shifting. He turned to Thompson. Where are these men? Saloon across the street, Thompson replied, acting nervous since they spotted our horses. Hollister nodded. Morgan, you and your men come with me. Miss Blackwood, you stay here where it's safe. He glanced at Charles, and so does he. I'm not leaving her alone with him, Yates said immediately. Fine, Hollister conceded. Thompson, you and Riley come with me. Morgan, keep an eye on our Boston gentleman here. After the sheriff and Thompson departed, an uncomfortable silence fell over the office. Charles stood near the window, ostensibly looking out at the street but clearly calculating his options. Sarah remained seated with Yates positioned protectively nearby. You've made a terrible mistake, Sarah, Charles finally said, his voice deceptively gentle. This infatuation with a common cowboy will pass, but the damage to your reputation, to your future prospects, that will be permanent. The only mistake I made was not seeing you for what you really are sooner, Sarah replied steadily. As for my future prospects, they're none of your concern. Charles's expression hardened. You belong to me, Sarah. I won't let some saddle tramp take what's mine. Yates took a step forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. She doesn't belong to anyone, least of all you. Stay out of this, Charles snapped. This is between me and my fiancé. Former fiancé, Sarah corrected firmly, and Yates is right where he belongs beside me. Something dangerous flashed in Charles's eyes. So it's like that, is it? You've given yourself to this nobody. I've chosen a good man over a cruel one, Sarah said simply, and it's the best decision I've ever made. Charles moved so suddenly that neither Sarah nor Yates anticipated it. In one fluid motion, he drew a small derringer from his vest pocket and aimed it directly at Yates. "Step away from her," he ordered, all pretense of civility gone. Yates froze, his hand hovering near his own sidearm. "Think carefully about what you're doing, Harrington." "Oh, I have," Charles replied, a disturbing calm settling over him. "I've thought about nothing else for months, how Sarah humiliated me by running away, how I would find her and bring her back where she belongs." His gaze shifted to Sarah. "And how I would deal with anyone who tried to keep her from me." Sarah rose slowly from her chair, heart pounding. "Charles, put the gun down. This won't end well for you. On the contrary," Charles smiled coldly. "I'm a respected businessman defending himself against a cattle thief who abducted my fiancé. Who do you think people will believe, especially once one of us isn't alive to tell a different story?" The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a surge of panic. Sheriff Hollister knows the truth. "He won't believe your lies." "The sheriff isn't here," Charles pointed out, "and frontier justice is so unpredictable." He steadied the derringer. "Now, Mr. Morgan, I suggest you say your goodbyes. Sarah and I will be returning to Boston." Time seemed to slow as Sarah saw Charles's finger tighten on the trigger. Without conscious thought, she moved a quick, desperate lunge that put her between Yates and the gun just as Charles fired. The report was deafeningly loud in the confined space of the office. Sarah felt a searing pain across her upper arm as the bullet grazed her, spinning her halfway around with the impact. Yates's reaction was instantaneous. In the moment of confusion following the shot, he closed the distance to Charles, disarming him with a swift, violent movement that left the Easterner gasping in pain as his wrist bent at an unnatural angle. The office door burst open, Sheriff Hollister and his deputy rushing in with guns drawn, followed closely by Thompson and Riley. "What happened?" Hollister demanded, taking in the scene, Charles on his knees clutching his injured wrist, Yates standing over him with the derringer now in his possession, and Sarah pressing a hand to her bleeding arm. "He tried to shoot Morgan," Sarah explained, wincing at the pain. "I got in the way." "She's lying," Charles protested desperately. "Morgan attacked me. I was defending myself." "Funny," Hollister said dryly. "Those men across the street just confessed that you hired them to ambush the cattle drive and bring Miss Blackwood to you. Said you paid extra for them to deal with anyone who got in the way." He nodded to his deputy. "Take Mr. Harrington to a cell. Attempted murder charges to start with. We'll add the rest after I take statements." As Charles was dragged away, still protesting his innocence, Yates rushed to Sarah's side. "Let me see," he said, gently examining her injured arm. "How bad is it?" "Just a graze," Sarah assured him, though the pain was considerable. "It looks worse than it is." Hollister approached them. "Doc Miller's just down the street. Best get that looked at, Miss Blackwood." He shook his head. "Brave thing you did, but foolish. Could have gotten yourself killed, or saved the man I love," Sarah replied simply. Yates's arms went around her then, careful of her injury but holding her close nonetheless. "Don't ever do that again," he whispered against her hair. "I couldn't bear to lose you." Sarah leaned into his embrace, the pain in her arm forgotten in the overwhelming relief that he was safe, that they both were safe, and that Charles's threat was finally, truly over. "You won't lose me," she promised. "Not now, not ever." The doctor confirmed that Sarah's wound was indeed minor, painful, but requiring only cleaning and bandaging. By the time they returned to the sheriff's office to give their formal statements, night had fallen completely over Auburn. Charles Harrington remained in custody, facing serious charges not only for the attack on Sarah and Yates, but for orchestrating the ambush on the cattle drive. The men he had hired had provided detailed confessions, eager to save themselves from harsher punishment. "He'll stand trial here," Sheriff Hollister assured them. "And with the evidence we have, he'll likely spend years in prison. When he finally gets out, I suggest you be far away, Miss Blackwood." "We will be," Yates said, his arm protectively around Sarah's shoulders. As they left the sheriff's office, the immediate danger past, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure. The chapter of her life that had included Charles Harrington was finally ending, not through escape or avoidance, but through justice. They secured rooms at a small hotel's separate rooms, though Yates made it clear to Thompson and Riley that they would take turns standing guard through the night, just as a precaution. Before retiring, Sarah and Yates stood together on the small balcony outside her room, looking out at the quiet town of Auburn. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear mountain air, a reminder of the many nights they'd spent beneath them on the cattle drive. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly. Yates's arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Now we continue to Sacramento, deliver the herd, collect our payment." He looked down at her, his eyes reflecting the starlight, and then Sarah smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "And then we go home, to Wyoming." The joy that spread across Yates's features was answer enough, but he put it into words nonetheless. "You're sure it won't be an easy life?" "I'm sure," Sarah nodded. "Easy isn't what I'm looking for, Yates, never was. I want a life that matters, with a man who sees me as I truly am." She rose on tiptoe to press a gentle kiss to his lips. "I want a life with you." Yates's response was to gather her in his arms, mindful of her injury but unable to restrain his happiness. His kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of all they would build together. "I love you, Sarah Blackwood," he murmured against her lips. "Have since the moment you looked up at me from that bench outside the saloon." Sarah smiled, remembering his first words to her. "Waiting for someone or leaving one?" "Neither," Yates recalled with a smile of his own. "Or perhaps both," you said. "I was wrong," Sarah realized. "I wasn't waiting or leaving. I was finding the man I was meant to love." Their journey to Sacramento was uneventful, a peaceful conclusion to what had been a tumultuous cattle drive. They reunited with the main herd just outside the city, where the cowboys greeted Sarah with genuine relief and congratulations when they learned of Charles's arrest. The cattle were delivered, the contract fulfilled, and the payment collected. Yates paid his men generously, including a bonus for those who had been injured in the ambush. On their last night together, before the cowboys would disperse, some returning to Wyoming with Yates, others seeking new employment in California, they gathered for a celebratory dinner at a proper restaurant in Sacramento. It was a boisterous affair, with toasts and stories and more laughter than Sarah could remember hearing in months. Late in the evening, Yates called for attention, rising to his feet with a glass in hand. "I want to thank all of you," he said, his deep voice carrying easily through the private dining room. "This drive had more than its share of challenges, but you men proved yourselves equal to every one of them." He looked around the table, meeting each cowboy's eyes. "I couldn't ask for a better crew." Murmurs of appreciation followed this statement, but Yates wasn't finished. "I also want to share some news," he continued, his gaze finding Sarah. "Miss Blackwood has agreed to return to Wyoming with me, not as our cook, though God knows we'd all be happier men for her biscuits." This drew chuckles from the cowboys. "But as my wife, if she'll have me." A hush fell over the table as all eyes turned to Sarah. Yates moved to her side, taking her hand and dropping to one knee in a gesture that seemed both old-fashioned and perfectly right. "Sarah Blackwood," he said, his voice softening to reach her alone despite their audience, "you've brought light back into my life when I didn't even realize how dark it had become. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Sarah looked down at this man who had rescued her outside a saloon, protected her on the trail, stood beside her against her past, and offered her a future she had never imagined. The answer was as clear as the love shining in his eyes. "Yes," she said simply. "With all my heart, yes." The cheers that erupted around them barely registered as Yates rose and pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love and partnership. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood on the deck of a riverboat heading east, watching the California landscape slide past. Beside her, Yates pointed out landmarks, his arm comfortably around her waist, the gold band on his finger catching the sunlight. They had been married in Sacramento, a simple ceremony attended by those cowboys who hadn't yet departed and a few friends Yates had in the city. Sarah had worn a new dress of deep blue silk, Yates's wedding gift to her with the silver comb securing her hair. Now they were journeying home to Wyoming, to the ranch Yates had described so vividly that Sarah could almost see it already, the sturdy house nestled against the foothills, the rolling pastures where his cattle grazed, the distant mountains standing sentinel over their land. Having second thoughts? Yates asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Sarah shook her head, smiling up at him. Not a single one, just thinking about how much my life has changed since that evening outside the Last Chance Saloon. Yates pulled her closer. For the better, I hope. For the better in every way, Sarah assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. Though I still don't have a good answer to your original question. Which was? Whether I was waiting for someone or leaving one, Sarah reminded him. I think the true answer is that I was doing both, leaving a man who wanted to possess me and waiting for a man who would love me for exactly who I am. Yates pressed a kiss to her temple. Well, Mrs. Morgan, that wait is over, and the leaving is far behind you. As the riverboat continued its journey eastward, carrying them toward their shared future, Sarah thought about the long road that had brought her to this moment, from the frightened woman fleeing Boston to the confident bride returning to Wyoming with the man she loved. She had set out seeking safety and independence. She had found those things, yes, but also something she hadn't known to look for: a love based on mutual respect and genuine partnership, with a man whose strength complemented her own rather than seeking to diminish it. What are you thinking now? Yates asked, noticing her smile. Sarah turned in his arms to face him fully. I'm thinking that sometimes the best journeys take us places we never intended to go. And sometimes, Yates added, bending to kiss her, the most important questions are the ones asked by strangers outside saloons. Sarah laughed, her heart full to overflowing with love for this man and the life they would build together. To think it all started with waiting for someone or leaving one. Best question I ever asked, Yates murmured against her lips before claiming them in a kiss that held all the promise of their shared tomorrows. On the deck of the riverboat heading east, under a vast blue sky that stretched from California to Wyoming and beyond, Sarah and Yates Morgan embraced their future, a future born in the wild uncertainty of the frontier, but anchored in the surest foundation of all. A love that had found them both exactly when they needed it most.